Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today. We are doing a series of webinars on the Urban Fellows program for the opening of the 9th batch of the fellowship. Our admissions are open and the application is live. And if you want more information, you can go on the website urbanfellows.ihs.co.in. But today, we're going to be touching on a really important topic, which many of our potential fellows and current fellows ask us about, which is what happens to your work life after the fellowship. What opportunities exist after doing the fellowship? And to cater to these questions, we have started a series of webinars called Employer Speak. And this is the second in the series, where we've invited collaborators, former students who have become employers, and friends of IHS to come join us and explain how Urban Fellows have worked with them, what they've been able to add in terms of value and critique and intellect to the work that these organizations are doing. And the core focus of the Urban Fellows program is to develop urban practice in people, right? To find people from diverse disciplines and diverse experiences of life to come and practice in the urban. And that has multiple pathways and multiple ways in which that shows up. And today you're going to get a set of examples from 3 different types of organizations that we have sent fellows to. We have a private sector enterprise and consulting company, WRI, where our colleague Lubaina will join us in a few minutes. There's Sonal Sharma here from SEWA Bharat, which is a development organization. And there's Ava Haider from the Aapti Institute, which is a think tank. And I am going to just be asking them questions and helping all of our potential fellows or potential applicants understand how fellows have worked with them. And as I begin, let me ask by asking our panelists today to explain a little bit about themselves. Can you please introduce yourself, what work you do, and tell us a little bit about the institution you come from? And tell us maybe a little bit more about how your work kind of engages with the urban, right? And maybe Sonal, I can ask you to begin and ask you to tell us a little bit about your history with IHS as well.
Thanks, Aditi. Super glad to be here. Considering I myself am an alumni from IIHS and I did the Urban Fellowship about 7, 8 years ago. I realized that I was the first batch of one of the first batch of fellows. So a little bit about myself. Uh, I'm currently employed with SEWA Bharat, uh, which is uh, which is part of the larger SEWA network of organizations. SEWA is Typically speaking, SEWA stands for Self-Employed Women's Association. It started off as a trade union 50 years ago, and ever since then has graduated into hundreds of different organizations, trade unions, power producer companies, artisan businesses, research institutions, insurance cooperatives, healthcare cooperatives, so on and so forth. Essentially, all the work that we do is geared towards um, the economic empowerment of women workers in the unorganized or the informal sector, um, which means that we're working at all of their issues, especially those that has to do with their work and their work lives. So, in terms of my educational training, I've studied business economics, I've studied development, and because of IIHS, I've also studied urbanization. And then I started my journey uh, in SEWA. I've been with SEWA actually for the past 7, 8 years. I've moved across the network, across 2 organizations. I started as an intern at SEWA Griharin, also called Sitara, which is the affordable housing finance institution within the SEWA network. One of its kind, actually. There are not enough financial organizations that are able to give formal institutional housing finance to women workers who don't have salary slips or don't have proper legal documents. And then I moved there, and I think I started off as a communications associate that moved from being a communications associate to a communications research and documentation associate. And I think it was at uh, Seva Griharin that I realized that my entire educational training was actually multidisciplinary. I studied business economics, which wasn't purely economics. Development, of course, dealt with all different facets of development. And in IIHS, you figure out that urbanization or urban is not the urban that you are used to. I'm from Delhi, and you see different facets of what a city is supposed to be or is meant to be, how it evolves as this thriving living being. Um, and I think I was able to learn really about how it is to work with a grassroots movement, which is also a social enterprise. From there, I moved to SEWA Bharat, which is a federation that works directly with all these trade unions, cooperatives, producing companies. Um, and actually, SEWA started off in an urban area, but has exponentially grown in the rural. Most of the areas that we work in right now, we figured out are urbanizing, uh, or they're turning into municipalities or councils. Um, and those challenges are new. Uh, Governance has evolved, so our field workers, we call them karyakartas, are having to uh, face a very different set of stakeholders. The members that we work with are having a very different set of stakeholders that they're interacting with, whether they're a street vendor or a construction worker or a home-based worker. Um, I think I'll just take a minute more, Aditi, and sort of talk to you about my own trajectory in Seva Bharat. I started off, I had the opportunity to set up the urban land rights vertical of Seva Bharat, and of course, uh, having just done an urban fellowship came in handy. I think uh, I think elements of what is tenure security beyond having a property title. It is also social protection, that it is also having access to basic infrastructure services, all those different layers of social security. But you can use the land, you can allot a piece of land, you can rent a piece of land, you can sell a piece of land. All the sort of learnings I was able to embed in this vertical. And then I moved to, because it's a not for profit, a lot of the work that we do is often influenced by where the philanthropic world wants to uh, donate money to. And then I moved to the microentrepreneurship vertical, which is so vastly different from an urban land rights vertical. And recently I've started a program on childcare. So I feel even in my practice, I've gone from different development problems. I've jumped across different development problems. And I think there was a moment where I felt like I was the urban land rights coordinator and then the micro entrepreneurship coordinator. I think it says in my CV, right? I just call myself a coordinator right now because really what it is looking at different problems that women in the informal sector have and how do you sort of create solutions? How do you design programs that can address those multiple problems? I think I'll stop there.
No, thank you so much. And I think just in your description, it's quite clear how quickly the intersections of issues start to become very apparent in the real world and how you have to be able to learn to move with them, right? It doesn't stop. Thank you for that. Ava, maybe I can move on to you next. And if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that the Aapti Institute does, and then your work at the Aapti Institute. Yeah, that would be a great start.
Thank you so much, Aditi, and thank you to IIHS for having me here. Thank you, Sonal. It was really great to hear about your trajectory as well. Mine's a bit, mixed, so I'm hoping that it's taken well. But essentially, so I'm Ava. I studied at Ashoka University, and I graduated in 2020. I did my studies in political science. And so then that's just broadly political theory and practice and data sets around elections and qualitative research around more political and social questions that we have. I also finished a thesis in my final year around understanding hip hop and social media, which is sort of a little bit off the field in terms of the work that I do now. But essentially to understand how cultures are built online, how trends influence other trends in other parts of the world. And so that was a really great time, of course, in terms of research. After that, I was a teaching fellow at my university, which also involved a lot of work in political theory and just literature, philosophy, slightly more generic turn. And after that, I was at a digital marketing company for about 3 months before I realized that it's maybe a little too off the path for me, but of course, always, a great learning experience. And it was after that that I joined Aapti Institute. So I've been at Aapti for about 2.5 years now. And we're often asked this question on what exactly we do at Aapti because the work is quite broad. But I suppose one way I'd put it is that it's about understanding how we make tech work efficiently and fairly for everyone that it touches. Because what tends to happen in sort of the digital realm, as is the case in the physical realm, is that existing hierarchies, existing practices, existing injustices tend to be configured for the digital space as well. And so understanding that as a point of unfairness and a point of development, we see how we can take things further in a way that include all perspectives. And so what we want to see then is how do stakeholders feel about implementing certain practices in their tech products versus, essentially what are their practices online in communicating some of these values versus user perspectives, understanding how users navigate the digital world. How do they think about online safety? How do they think about, more contentious topics? How do they think about hate speech? So these are some of the more user-led perspectives we've looked at as well. We've also seen how data can be mobilized and used well, and again, more efficiently and fairly for use cases in the environment, for, like I said, online safety and trust. We're also focused on understanding judicial applications of tech and data in that way. And some of our work that's a little bit more public, I think, is our work with the gig economy and gig work economy, and understanding how mobility can be made more equitable, rather the practices around digital and mobility can be made more equitable. And we're also concerned with understanding how the more social and gendered and cultural differences play in how access to digital products is met, how inclusion is conceived of in different stakeholders' minds, and how all these things are eventually practiced and if they're tested well, essentially. So yeah, that's just an overview, I think, of the work that we do at Aapti, and it is, like I said, extremely broad. But I work as a senior associate, and I have been on a couple of projects. Currently, I'm working on a project to understand how women in India trust in digital platforms and welfare-enabled apps like UPI or any of the apps that are currently emerging under the IIHS Bharat digital mission and other governance sort of led apps. And essentially understanding how women make those decisions. How do they make trade-offs? How do they make choices, essentially, on not just these apps, but also social media apps? What is it that you consider important to you? And is it different because you are, a woman? I think that we're trying to focus on understanding how your personal differences or your personal characteristics also play into those decisions, that more emotional decisions that you might make through technology. And, these are understudied in the way that we see it. And this is one of the things that we're focusing on that I'm focusing on at Aapti. I've done a little work on understanding DPIs, which are digital public infrastructures for anyone who's new to the concept, and understanding how different stakeholders in the ecosystem fund parts of DPIs, how they fund, collaborative partnerships, how they look at building long-term sustainability around these projects, and also what is the role that the private sector should play versus the philanthropic sector, and so on and so forth. I've also done a little work on understanding on the online safety space for encrypted platforms. So a WhatsApp or a Signal or a Viber, essentially, how do they strategize against online harms? And what is an approach that might be able to, ensure that privacy needs of citizens are met, while also ensuring that people are not being sort of disproportionately harmed on these platforms. So that's just a long and short. I could go into a little bit more detail, I think, in terms of the formats. But just I think it might be helpful for the students that are here to know that given that we are a think tank, we are a research organization, of course, our main priority is to produce knowledge. And so reports and things like that, of course, come into the picture. But we also strive to see impact in other directions. And so things like playbooks and toolkits and understanding slightly more action-oriented ways of putting our research out is a big focus for us. We've also worked, on, like I said, the gig economy. And so the format for something like that is a drivers advisory council. And that, I think, is, a slightly more public, more event-based and more sort of engagement-based way of putting our recommendations down on, for people to experience. So range of ways in which we're looking at impact. But yeah, I'm going to stop there and give it back to Aditi.
No, thank you. And that was such a nice overview of the very complex terrain that Aapti has entered into, and the ways in which like the digital economy or the digital space is interacting with all these issues, right? So thank you for that. And I think I'll just take a second to introduce Lubaina, who's just joined us. Lubaina, we started just a few minutes ago just by introducing ourselves and the institutions that we're working at. To give potential applicants who are on this webinar, who are listening in, a sense of the different areas people go work after the fellowship. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit more about the WRI and your work at WRI.
Um, Hi, I'm Lubaina Rangwala. I'm program head for the Urban Development and Resilience practice at WRI. It's part of the Sustainable Cities and Transport team. And essentially, the Sustainable Cities and Transport program at WRI it looks at all of the sort of urban work that we do at the Institute in India. We work across, from so one large chunk of our work is on mobility. So sustainable mobility that ranges from public transport, accessible streets, integration across modes, last mile connectivity, and a lot of like new work that's happening over the last 3-4 years on electrification of transport, and what that means in terms of some of the technology side, batteries, and a lot of a lot of non-transport but support kind of materiality of how some of these innovations will come in the ecosystem, and what impact it's going to make to jobs, to the ways in which people travel, and yeah. So there's all of that work. And in the Urban Development and Resilience program, we've been working on, in the past, a lot of spatial planning and regional planning, working on how some of these concepts of sustainability can be kind of integrated into the ways in which growth is being planned in cities, and how other associated sectors like transport and water, and how do they sort of interact with spatial planning, because historically in India we've only kind of know how to do physical planning, but a lot of other pieces in terms of how fiscal mechanisms can be embedded in the ways in which you draft a plan that really allows for more implementation to actually happen if some of those associated aspects are thought through. But a lot of the recent work that I've been part of, over the last decade in WRI is on climate resilience, and really understanding how climate change that in the past was largely a sort of a at the subnational level was more a state subject, and not really something that planning professionals really could engage in at the city level. But in the last decade, through various efforts, we've been engaging at community level to understand how climate change has impacted people and communities, livelihoods. How do you begin to start making sense of some of these impacts in terms of regulations, and how do you basically take that knowledge and begin to talk to departments that are essentially planning, physically planning the city, to today, where we are actually over the past 3-4 years have been, and I'm much before actually, because a lot of even our climate program had been working on city climate action plans, but more recently, I mean, I've been involved in the Mumbai climate action plan, and a lot of work on how some of the ways in which infrastructure is coming out in the cities. Are we able to think in the long term, right, and able to understand how climate risks are actually going to impact people in the short, medium, and long term? Because I mean, in most of our master plans are 20-year plans, So we are planning today for the next 20 years, but we don't really anticipate risk. And so you're constantly also planning in potentially high risk areas with high built up densities, land uses that may not really survive in the face of some of these risks. And how do you begin to have those conversations with departments, with various stakeholders? And so that's, one part of the kind of work on planning. But also there's a lot of, focus in the recent years on greening, for example. So over the last 2 years in Mumbai, we've been working, and of course across many other Indian cities, working on nature-based solutions and greening. But how do you do that in, sustainable manner? Ensure that a lot of environmental indicators, biodiversity indicators, those are embedded in the ways in which cities are greening, are kind of planning for some of these infrastructures. And while, there is a lot of, focus on, again, big infrastructure projects for climate adaptation. So immediately, governments are planning, high, like concrete edges along the sea or the water, whether it's a river in Mumbai or the coastal sort of infrastructures that are coming up. But we aren't really able to integrate natural solutions in some of these. So some of the cities have actually grown to a point where natural solutions may not essentially work. So what does the hybrid really look like? And really sort of working, with engineers, with departments to understand what those are, and getting to the kind of nitty-gritties of, do we have the right standard operating procedures in place, SOPs? Do we have the right, tender documents that are going out to ask for the right consultants to come on board? Do we have the right data? Do we need, different kinds of information to make decisions that are more holistic? So it's really sort of trying to understand, at what level of, because we often kind of say that, we need capacity or we need, institutional reform, but what does that really mean? What are truly the gaps? And we've been able to, because we're working sort of at this umbrella level, able to kind of bring down, understand some of these gaps over the last, few years of working very closely with government at the city level. But then also understand that some of these then, have to be pathways that come from maybe national government or some kind of supply line, whether it's like finance or programs that are being planned at the national level or the subnational level, where governments that are not Mumbai, I mean, Mumbai is a very rich municipal corporation, but there are, small and medium cities that really require finance, require capacity. So what are those conduits of, support that these cities will begin to get to make decisions that are different? And how do the cities, make choices between solutions? Like, is there, forms of aggregation that can start happening? So there's, a lot of interesting work. I mean, even in terms of urban finance for climate solutions, what is the role that, private capital can play to help meet some of the finance deficits, because municipal funds cannot be the only solution. So it's really, the work sort of spans across various sectors. So we work, I spoke about the transport work, but we also kind of work on in the water resilience space, on greening and nature-based solutions, on TOD, a lot of work in the past, that WRI has done on transit-oriented development. So yeah, that's broadly some things that we do.
No, super exciting. And I think, what's quite clear in the first 10-15 minutes is that, one, I think especially for Sonal and Ava, both of you have very interdisciplinary sets of training, right, that you talked about, and your career trajectories themselves have gotten you to a place where you can work at these intersections. And I think one of the things that the fellowship tries to do is to help streamline that process and to get, new fellows and new students to get there a bit faster. And to not have to go through the several complicated and sometimes very lonely pathways of trying to understand what an atypical career looks like, right? Even though you're really trying to get at issues in the real world which are super interconnected, and you can't just be an economist solving women's work issues. You need all of these different things to kind of play in. And I guess, Lubaina, in your comments, it was very clear that WRI has a very clear urban focus. In that sense, I think the trajectory is out of the fellowship into, say, an organization like WRI a bit more straightforward. But maybe for Sonal and Ava, if you can help us understand, how does the urban fit into the work you do? Is it a sector? Is it a framing? Is it just where research projects happen? Because both of you have also taken in fellows over the last few years and have worked with them, and I'd be interested to hear what they bring, back into the research projects that you're doing, or the different kinds of work you're doing, not just research. Maybe Sonal, we can start with you, because you said that there was obviously an urban beginning, but SEWA is also spread across many geographies. So is the urban just a geography? Is it something else?
Yes, definitely, quite literally an important side of work. But I think it's also in the past decade or so evolved, more than a decade, of course, evolved as a certain lens through which you look at development problems. A lot of them are wicked development problems. Uh, in my experience in Seva and whatever I learned back in IIHS, I've learned that, urban is it's this really hyper local space as well. It's a space of community and collaboration, displacement, contestation, respite, um, and learning how to navigate the urban space is key to forming any kind of strategy for any development problem that you want to work with. I'll give you an example. Um, we work across the city of Delhi, and one of the areas we work in, it's called Raghuveer Nagar. It's a resettlement colony in Western Delhi. It's a resettlement colony in the sense that communities there were resettled by the state, but it's actually an informal settlement, and it does not have access to adequate infrastructure services. Residents there do not have access to secure tenure, and this informal sites sort of spring up over the passage of time, right? And there's a slum, uh, uh, a certain juggi in that area, which informally sprung up. It is not one of the originally allocated plots, which means that they don't have access to household toilets. The nearest toilet that they access is across the road, which is a community toilet. One of the biggest complaints that came from that area is that it's an unsafe place. We've seen people video record women inside. It's not maintained well. There is no access to pipe water supply, etc., etc. And before we could even solve that, before we could even bring it up to the municipal corporation, the first thing that we learned is that toilet is uh, in an area administered by a certain ward councillor, which is across the road, and the actual settlement is under the administration of another board council, which was opposing political parties being the point here. So you're not working with just a stakeholder, you're working with multiple stakeholders, often which are often sort of not amenable to each other's causes and vision. And uh, it took a lot of learning, it took a lot of failures to ultimately get that toilet up and running, functioning. Uh, a lot of the solutions were community led. We had to think of when we had to go to an elected representative versus when we go to a nominated one. We had to run signature campaigns, we had to run Twitter campaigns, and we had to work specifically in conjunction, in partnership with the local government. Um, the reason I'm saying this is that urban, I feel like even though there's a lot of institutions, individuals who are studying the urban, it's a very layered site, and it as many layers it has, it needs double the number of strategies that can work in it. Uh, want to also say that uh, we work across tier one, tier two, tier three, tier four cities, and the way Kolkata works is right from the way Malda works, or the way Gurdaspur works is right from the way Patiala or Chandigarh works in Punjab. So we've had to learn and unlearn a lot of the ways that citizens access their rights, access basic services that should be entitled to them, and how do you navigate governance systems and governance structures in sort of uh, getting that access. Yeah.
Super helpful. Thank you. So it shapes your entire set of strategies that you can use on the field when
Yeah.
you're trying to create some very basic kinds of changes. Really
Yeah.
helpful. Thank you. But maybe in your work life with the work life of Aapti, which is quite different, right? Because there are sets of policy stakeholders, there are models and strategies that Aapti is trying to implement. So in that sense, what does the urban look like for you and for Aapti Institute? And maybe you can give us some examples of fellows if they've been able to bring some of that thinking with them as they come intern with you and then work on at the Aapti Institute.
Right. So, I think my perspective on this is going to be quite different because I think at least in the projects that I'm involved in, we have a very different way of just approaching the urban. But also, I think that I think what I'm going to do after I speak is drop a couple of links to the projects which I think focus more on that concept of urbanity that we're talking about here today. But the work that I'm doing that I sort of mentioned earlier on understanding trust. I think what we've seen in this research specifically is understanding slightly more social and socio-patriarchal dynamics that exist as a difference between rurality and urbanity. So that's something that I think that, given the work that we look at in the trust work that we do, we're trying to see how women's social networks operate differently when they're in urban localities versus rural localities. And I think what we're seeing just as an insight is that, there tends to be more stronger sort of social connections in most rural locations versus urban locations. And so some of the insights that we're looking at here are geared very much towards the project. But I think one of the more general ways I would say that Aapti is looking at that space is to think about infrastructure, right? And just that slightly more meta question of what is infrastructure for people and how do they conceive of their touch points in the places that they consider their home / their surrounding sort of surrounding comforts, right? Or surrounding sort of facilities that they have. So how do people interact with infrastructure? How do people think about their connectivity? I think it's also important to think about the proximity that someone has to other networks. And so, for instance, like in the rural space, we're seeing slightly more social support. And so then that concept of infrastructure isn't necessarily, what is my access to the state or what is my access to the service only. It is also about who do I know who can get me what I need to get at that level. And so then in my head, sort of social connections and networks at that level become very strong parts of infrastructure, which are read very differently in the urban space versus the rural space, at least in the research that I've been doing over the past year. And broadly, I think that what's interesting about the digital framing around some of this is that I know that there are sort of metrics around which we think about the difference between urban and rural, right? So the proximity in terms of, okay, you might be 5 kilometers from X or 2 kilometers from your nearest Y and so on, or this is how much electricity there is in that space. But I think that the digital is where we're seeing a lot of disruption of that kind of metric. And so, having to grapple with someone's connectivity in that way is a change, I think, at least in the way that we're seeing. So it's definitely not a clear question for me. But we're also doing a little bit of work on understanding the data side of some of this. So, the data of migrants when they're moving and refugees when they're moving through different urban locations, for instance. So that's another space where we are doing a little bit of research, and I'm going to tag the appropriate sort of people in the chat down there so that you can, and happy to make the connect with the people working here. To your question on, sort of how do the, maybe, so one of the people working on this project is a UFB graduate. And, I think that what maybe like, if I could elaborate at this stage, I would say that there is a sort of focus, I think, on understanding people, not just people in terms of the roles they play within a certain research problem or, world as such, but also who they are as people outside of that, right? So I think that understanding what are their cues, what are their signals, what are the things that kind of get them to not perform, but what makes them get out of bed in the morning almost. How do you localize the thinking to that extent? I think that's what has been really interesting to experience as part of, this colleague of mine, her mindset and what she brings to the team in that sense. And so in one word, I would say that it's just the repositioning of the camera at some level is understanding that through some of the work that we're doing is one way how I sort of answer your question there.
No, thank you. Super, super helpful, I think. And I mean, what I think is coming across is that an ability for a person to be able to understand what people in different walks of life and disciplines are talking about is a skill to have in life, and it's a skill that's built, and it's not an inherent quality people are born with. It is something that you can learn, and that is something you can learn in a classroom, and it really helps you to be able to then go back to the world around you and see things differently, right? Like very nicely, like you put it, you can reposition the camera once you know that you have to kind of do that. You have to find the cues and look for that. And I think that's a really nice competency, I think, that we try and focus on in the fellowship, and we hope that, students come out with that. Lubaina, maybe taking that question forward about skills and competencies, when you're hiring, not only taking in interns, but maybe making a more formal hiring decision for a longer term, what are the kinds of skills and sensibilities do you look for in people who work for you? And if there have been some examples from maybe previous fellows that have worked with you or that you've worked with that you can help guide us through, that would be really helpful.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, we've actually worked, I mean, in my team in Mumbai, we worked with two fellows. And I think, I said this at the alumni meet as well, that, when we get UFP students, I think what has been really nice to see is that, I think the basic, very sort of core planning sensibilities in terms of, um, certain values and ethics in what we kind of want to have as a shared sort of idea, is something that's very like front and center with most of the fellows we worked with from IIHS. And I think it's good to have that in young people, right? Because then you engage in the city, whatever you're thrown into, with a certain with a certain, I mean, you have the skills and all of that, but also sort of with a core understanding that it's like leading to somewhere, even if it's mundane work with government sitting through arduous data sets, etc., that there is a certain larger idea that this is going to kind of collectively move towards a certain outcome. Like we saw that in the past, where an intern who worked on with the water and flooding team, with a very sort of strong water equity focus, seeing the connects. And so I mean, with him it was more of a sort of theoretical and came from more kind of a research academic leaning, but could see these very mundane meetings as is very important kind of data and the ways in which everyday planning occurs, and could sort of extract that and that was the fuel. So even though the kind of what was expected of looking at some of the, like, looking at tender documents or looking at regulations, it's a very boring kind of work that may not be as exciting, right? But the fact that you also got access to the ways in which some of these really transpire in everyday governance, and being able to get your excitement in that, right? And I think because for young people, I think that balance is important. Really, what is there's a lot of like what we end up doing in an everyday basis is not it doesn't I don't know how to explain, but it's not like a drawing that you're making that's going to go be published somewhere. There's no sort of big dream, right? It's a very sort of everyday kind of work that may be very mundane, but if you're being able to extract that, and I feel like I think most of the interns we worked with have that sensibility, which has been endearing and good to see. Currently, we actually hired someone who worked with us as an intern, and she's working, Neha Shigwan, she's working with us in our team. And again, very nimble in being able to really, I mean, she comes with a lot of like technical skills in managing both sort of the design side of things, software, being able to put very quickly put certain basic drawings together or visuals together, but at the same time understands kind of the governance side of it. So it was easy to also, when she came in as an intern, it was easy to also split her time across two projects, wherein there was one piece that in fact just yesterday, we were on a webinar on the Mumbai climate budget, which is one piece of work that, she's been able to really bring together, working with the BMC every day, just looking through mundane kind of budgetary allocations that each department, and trying to extract that, make sense of it, help put together a report on the climate budget. So there is so I mean, just I mean, that's basically what really, I think, for us is an important, I would say, asset, is that you don't really see the work as a place to just produce something that is tangible, right? The tangible is just like an output in our language, right? But really the everyday, building the relationships with government officers, building kind of understanding that this is the space of practice, and really being able to maneuver through these departments, being able to kind of see how far you can take that output, how do you build on it, and how do you kind of, so because some of these, what you produce is just an intermediary product, which actually needs to kind of connect many different dots, right? And I think that, yeah, it's been good to kind of see young people who are able to give time to learn. And yeah, I think those are the things that we've been we've been looking at. Yeah.
And we're an excellent example to actually have someone who comes in with a perspective of wanting to work on water equity, and them having to find the most mundane documents to find equity in, which is not an easy thing to do. And so you can come with the sensibility of, human rights and equity, but really to enact it, to find it, to put it in practice, takes all of these kind of interdisciplinary skills where you can just be able to communicate and speak freely to other people, and have the confidence to be able to do it. Thanks for that. Maybe Sonal, I can ask you to also
Yeah.
answer that. And I mean, there's a complimentary question in the chat, which is what's the hard skill and what's the non-hard skill? And I think Lubaina's answer gave us a little bit about that. But even for the SEWA context, if you could help us see what's perspective, what's competence, what's hard skill, and what's really what do you look for as a hiring manager?
Before I answer that, I'd like to sort of address the question you had previously, which is what have I seen? Because I realized that SEWA Bharat, ever since I graduated from IIHS, has hired interns from IIHS each year. A lot of them have had permanent jobs, but I think one core strength that I've observed is definitely adaptability. I think because they've been trained uh, uh, with a special focus on interlinkages and intersectionality. I've seen, for instance, a lot of people who apply to IIHS naturally are architects, and I've seen a lot of architects and planners who come to SEWA and have done something entirely unrelated to their own field or their own discipline. I've seen a lot of them um, uh, use their ability to design or to think of design and how really you get there in programs. So how do you design a development program around a certain problem that you have to address? I've seen them eventually use data as as a tool for evidence-backed advocacy and help communities come up with different strategies of using data that pertains to their problems in lobbying for, advocating for with local governments, state governments for what they want. I've also one great thing is because there are interns from all over the country. I've seen that being multilingual or bilingual comes in handy quite a lot, because as a central trade union or as a federation associated with the central trade union, we work across 18 states in the country. And if there's someone who speaks Hindi or someone who speaks Bengali, it comes in handy. If there's an intent to work with communities, there's a lot of learning on the job, and they're essentially translators or facilitators, not translators in the literal sense, but they're facilitators of a lot of knowledge that exists within communities, then to reach spaces where some solutions could be co-created. Um, as to your second question, I think I'd like to sort of flip it a little, and maybe you were going to come to it, and sort of address the question of uh, what can we offer as a development city organization to uh, to graduates from a fellowship such as such as one that IIHS offers, and what skills should they then have, and how it can benefit them. So I think, firstly, in very simple terms, it's coming with a certain openness to understand life at the grassroots for mainly for women or even their families. And that openness sort of really helps in a lot of unlearning and learning about different problems and that our lives, uh, or at least for myself, I came from a certain educational background, from a certain socioeconomic background, and I've learned that there are multiple lives which are very, very different than ours. So if you have to work in a community-based organization or a CSO, you've got to really come up with an open mind uh, uh, to see what cannot work for you and for them. Secondly, I really do believe that having a technical skill set and what I just helps you, how do you employ that wherever you end up, whether it's a government organization or a consultancy or a CBO, it is that these skills are transferable. You have to come up with creative solutions to employ those skills. You could be a planner, but you could be actually working with the research team. You could be an architect, but you could be working with a communications team. Or you could be working directly in communities. I think that's definitely super handy. And finally, uh, you'd be in a role that uh, within a development institutions where you get to influence policy, where you get to influence money. Where does funding go? You get to influence international development organizations, bilateral, multilateral organizations, and you're not typically a field worker if you're working with an organization. Like I said, I call myself a coordinator, but I'm actually a facilitator. I'm the bridge between what the communities have to say and what they have to ask, especially vulnerable communities, and what could be offered. I think that's if that works for you, you're kind of an influencer. If that sort of is your thing, and you get to the kind of exposure and access that you get is insurmountable. It is not within your sector, it's beyond. So, whatever skill set that you may have, if you know how to embed that within the institution and then make the best use of it, there's so much that you can learn, so much access you can have. Just speaking about myself, I have, and my colleagues, we have presented to chief ministers, to ambassadors, and we've also presented to gender heads of the World Bank or the BN or a big philanthropy. We've worked with sarpanches, we've worked with counselors, we've worked with communities, and just getting those perspectives really, really helps in figuring out what you want to do and how do you want to approach your work.
Excellent, thank you. I think we're very evocative also in kind of helping explain what you can do with this. So I have a last question, and it's really very open-ended. It's not very directly related to, the fellows you might have worked with, but what do you think that the labor market is looking for in the next 5 years in the areas you're working in, right? This is the next 5 years of people's working lives. What should young people who are entering the labor market, entering education programs like our own, what should they be thinking about their own kind of trajectories? And especially both Lubaina and Ava, you both are working in climate change and the digital economy, both really like the most compelling kind of challenges ahead of us. I would love to hear from the both of you on what that would look like. What are the competencies, skills, education, training for the next 5 years?
Just to sort of add, I'm actually equally excited to hear about this because we've learned even within our work in SEWA, we've said that gender is a lens, gender is the entry point, but now climate justice has become a new lens. Digital inclusion has become a new lens, and these are questions that we are also grappling with. So really looking forward to it.
Yeah. Maybe Ava, maybe I can ask you to start, and then Lubaina, maybe you can add on.
Yeah, sure. Just to caveat though, like I suppose only know in the sense of the kind of work that Aapti does and the organizations that we're also
Absolutely, sure.
similar to, right? So and therefore would not want to paint a bleak picture because the sort of landscape is such that research, the money for research is what it is. And we are constantly battling different kinds of stakeholders in trying to understand how do we make the most of these interests together, and how do we make sure we can do it in ways that serve everyone's, sort of everyone's purpose in this. But just maybe as a sort of build up from actually the question someone asked in the chat, right? Is that what are the hard skills we're looking at that level? And I think that, when it comes to research specifically, I think beyond, hey, can you write a report, or hey, can you build a structure before you write the report, and hey, can you, communicate in English, can you communicate in Hindi, can you do it in Kannada, like, do you have language diversity? I think beyond what we see on an application form, it is important to think about it in a way that, when you apply for a job, I think for you to be making solutions in that space makes sense to you as a person. And so then that mission statement is for you an identification of, whether this is a place that enables you to do that. And so at some level, I think that what people will look for beyond can you perform the role of a researcher is how imaginative are you when you are looking at building solutions themselves. Because recommendations are really important in the line of work that we do. Research cannot just be about the exploration, although that is also very valuable. It does also have to touch upon, what's the so what? What is this useful for at some level? And even if it's just useful for the concept, why and how, and what will it influence? And the challenge isn't always, thinking of a really novel idea or an original way of solving something, but it is about making sure that you've picked a seductive or persuasive format for the person that you're making listen to you, right? And so then that's kind of my second point, where I think we have to think about effective communication as a very hard skill in the way that we do the work that we do, because obviously writing becomes important in that way. And it's important to move past jargon and make things make sense. But this is also just not about simplicity. It's about creating relevance and recreating relevance based on who you're repositioning your work to. So, okay, this makes sense to someone in a private tech company at the public policy level, right? This is something that makes sense to their sensibility. Or, okay, now this may make sense in a different way to someone else working in the philanthropic space who might have very different developmental aspirations and so on and so forth. And so stakeholder communication is a very, very solid part of the job, and you have to be able to straddle the interests in that sense. And that's definitely, I'm beyond research, I think it is an important priority in how we try and make our work speak to people. And then sort of, sorry, I feel like I'm losing track of the question exactly, Aditi, but in terms of what you're saying,
just like what skills are required for the next 5 years in the labor market, but I think you've answered that directly. Like,
yes, I think, maybe just the last thing I'll say, right? And I think that this is something I did want to say because of the sort of great way in which I really highly regard the UFP colleagues that we have at Aapti because of just the new lens they bring into the workspace. But I think that it's important for me to word it this way too, which is that, as I said, it's about repositioning the camera, and that's a very novel way of thinking. In traditionally research heavy, very, very, like, these are spaces that have tradition, right? So what I'm trying to say is that what slightly alternative, or what we may consider design thinking, as people who are not design thinkers love throwing that out there. But what I did want to say is that it is also like something I've read, very long ago, which is, what is that person's subjective environment, and can that person channel someone else's subjective environment in what they're saying? And so, for instance, if you are a bat, for instance, and the way a bat navigates and understands its world is through sound, right? And it's essentially blind. So what I'm trying to say is that understanding how that bat navigates its subjective environment, it's somewhat similar to how we might think of people with differing capacities, capabilities, people who are fundamentally different in terms of their culture, how they might think of their semiotic and like signage very differently, and how they respond to the world. That's a perspective that I think, as you said, may not always be taught, but I do think it's something that in this space is a very valuable way to present your thinking. But anyway, I'm going to stop there.
No, thank you. I think the point on positionality and how an interdisciplinary program that teaches practice can get you there, but then you have to learn how to apply it, is really, really valuable. Lubaina, maybe you can also respond to that, and then we can just end in a few minutes.
Yeah. So I mean, the practice around climate has actually evolved over the last 10 plus years. There are now established programs, and I think most universities have a sort of climate program, have a department that's actually doing work around it. So a lot more professionals are coming out in the market with degrees around sustainability, sustainability management, and climate resilience, and all of that. I think where so two things that I would want to say. One is, there is this kind of urgency in a lot of ways in which we think from a climate lens. It's constantly framed in this idea of crisis. And I think one thing for young professionals to watch out for is to understand that, we also are simultaneously living in a large developmental deficit, and to not sort of lose sight of that. Ideas or work around climate justice, just transitions, inclusivity in climate action, like these are really important sort of pieces that need to kind of work alongside the need for urgency and this kind of need to act now, right? And I think watching out for maladaptation, that very easily can be an outcome of a lot of like urgent climate action, is something that professionals need to really kind of learn about, watch out for, because I thinking very technocratically about the problem can be a really big problem, right? So that's one kind of caution I would say, in terms of the kind of additional trainings and programs. There are lots of like online courses and things that you can opt for to build those skills, to watch out for, also sort of balancing out on some of these other aspects. There's also in the last some years a lot of focus on environmental justice and importance of biodiversity. So this kind of balancing out environment and climate again is an important thing to watch out for, because a lot of just thinking from a carbon lens, for example, and not really understanding that a solution sits within an ecology and within an environment is also important to orient and understand what are some of the co-benefits of solutions, and being able to kind of supplement your training with these aspects. The last point is on the importance of finance. There's a lot of focus on climate finance and really building out that space, and I think that is definitely a skill that India definitely is going to need. But what kinds of finance, and how do we ensure that the right sort of, again, safety mechanisms around watching out for injustices that could happen when you're really sort of building certain finance pieces, like nature as capital. There are lots of these kinds of initiatives coming out, and understanding that people and communities, or people and nature live in tandem. And so if you just look at nature as one singular problem and don't understand that people are actually within that ecosystem and they're very much part of nature, right? And if a particular way of governing a natural ecosystem is anti-community or anti-people within that ecosystem, then that's not really a solution that works for that place. So I think these are some of the things that I would look out for. And because as I said, climate as a practice has been around, and there is a lot of established kind of knowledge and training around it. So I would actually, I'm just approaching the question in a how to build your training in a much more sort of rounded manner. So that's all I would like to say.
Oh, really helpful. And I think Sonal and I would have also picked up something, because I was also looking to see what both of your answers would be. No, thank you all so much. I really want to extend my gratitude for sharing your experiences with us, also your own personal experiences of your own career trajectories, and also what you look for when you bring new people on. I think what we'll do is, because we're at time, we'll pause here, and Avaz also put links in the chat, and the institutions that are represented here, all their work is online, as are, our fellows' experiences with them on the Urban Fellows website. So I would ask anyone applying to please have a look at that, look at the testimonials, and thank you all for joining us. We'll pause here. Thank you.